Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Pascal's wager is one of the more respectable arguments in favor of religion. As an atheist, I am nonetheless sympathetic to this argument, because it attempts to use reason to actually persuade people to believe in God, rather than circularly using the Bible as a reason to believe in the truth of the Bible. Of course, as an atheist, I also believe that Pascal's wager is a mistaken argument, but here I will give it the consideration it deserves. Pascal's wager is named after Blaise Pascal, a 17th century mathematician and philosopher, also known for his invention of one of the first mechanical calculators. This is the essence of the argument. If one believes in God and ends up being wrong, one has nothing to lose. One's ultimate fate is no worse than if one did not believe in God and ended up being right. On the other hand, if one believes in God and ends up being right, one has everything to gain, especially an eternal life full of bliss. Pascal is to be commended for examining two possible outcomes and their implications. However, he fails to grasp the full range of the possibilities. Pascal only explores the possible outcomes if one chooses to believe in God. He fails, however, to consider the possible outcomes if one chooses not to believe in God. So, let us refine Pascal's argument a bit and consider it then. We must consider not one, but two different alternatives. One can either believe in God or not believe in God, and in each case, one can either be right or wrong. So, there are in fact four possibilities. Someone who believes in God and is right will go to heaven. Someone who believes in God and is wrong will simply cease to exist after death, if it is indeed the case that death is a cessation of one's being and individuality. Someone who does not believe in God and is wrong will go to hell, to assume the worst-case scenario. Someone who does not believe in God and is right, if he dies, will cease to exist just like the believer who is wrong. Even if we grant that heaven is better than hell from an atheist's perspective, hell is not the worst possible outcome. The worst possible outcome is the one that the atheist already assumes to be the case after death. In hell, one may suffer horribly, but one still retains one's individuality, sensations, and thoughts. The sheer non-existence that an atheist believes to follow death is much more frightening. So frightening that unlike heaven or hell, it is not even conceivable for an existing individual. So, if I do not believe in God, and happen to be wrong, and go to hell, I will still be much better off than if I believed in God, and were wrong, and ceased to exist. No matter how greatly God may punish me for disbelief, the punishment will pale in comparison to what I already think is coming. But it is still not enough to consider the four alternatives in terms of what happens after death. It is also important to look at how a choice to believe or not affects one's life in terms of time spent doing particular things, attending church services, uttering prayers, and partaking in numerous ceremonies, as well as the foregone opportunities that this time could have been devoted to. This is not to mention the lost opportunities from various dietary prohibitions, prohibitions on work, and tradition-based restrictions that seem to have little to do with abstract theology. So, it is not the case that someone who believes has nothing to lose. He has a tremendous amount of time and foregone opportunities to lose. I like doing work on Sundays, and the time I would spend attending church would be wasted if I believed in God and were wrong. But it would be well spent if I did not believe in God and were right and spent that time doing productive work. The time would even be well spent if I disbelieved in God and were wrong, because I would still accomplish something real in this world during that time. Believe me, all those Sundays add up. Furthermore, if non-existence after death is worse than hell, then that, and not the possibility of hell, is the foremost problem that needs to be addressed. If this were the year 1900, I would not have a chance of plausibly saying this, but we are on the verge of astonishing medical breakthroughs that will at the least dramatically expand the human lifespan in this world. If you are interested, I urge you to look up the work of Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil, both distinguished world-class scientists who believe that we can achieve effectively indefinite longevity within the next 30 to 40 years. I can understand placing one's bets on eternal life in heaven during an era in which eternal life in this world was definitely out of reach. But if the possibility of existing indefinitely in this world, a world we can be sure of, is offered, it is surely preferable to the mere faith of existing forever in another world for whose existence there is no evidence. So, I hereby invert the Pascal's wager argument and offer my own version, Stolyarov's wager, for why you ought to exert your utmost efforts to extend your life in this world and to assist in any way you can the technological developments that make this possible. If you believe in human life extension and are right, you have everything to win. A happy, prosperous, indefinite life that you can be sure of in this world. If you believe in human life extension and are wrong, you will someday cease to exist. If you do not believe in human life extension and are right, you will someday cease to exist. If you do not believe in human life extension and are wrong, it may be that the effort you did not put in to promoting this idea was just enough for the possibility not to come to pass, and then someday you will cease to exist. Unlike the fully developed version of Pascal's wager, the choice here is clear and unambiguous. You have everything to gain and nothing to lose by focusing your attention on this world and on extending your life in it.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be offering some commentary on Christopher Hitchens' recent article in Vanity Fair called Trial of the Will. Christopher Hitchens is a man whom I respect greatly. He is, of course, a very outspoken atheist, one of the leading atheist thinkers of our time, and a prolific commentator on culture and society and current events. A very eloquent man whose rhetorical abilities and whose unique style always make for an enjoyable read. I don't always agree with every one of his positions, but it gives me a great deal of pleasure to read his work, and it also greatly pleases me that he continues to write in the face of the terrible predicament that he is in, since he is afflicted with terminal esophageal cancer. In fact, Hitchens' article, I think, can be interpreted in multiple ways, but I do agree with his main thesis. His main thesis is that Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, was incorrect when he offered the phrase, "Whatever does not kill me makes me stronger." Hitchens makes an extremely valid point throughout his article, supported by numerous examples, that there are quite debilitating conditions, both in a physical sense and in a mental sense, that cannot possibly be said to have redeeming benefits that more than outweigh the suffering that they inflict and the diminution of capacity that they inflict on human beings. This is not just a loss of physical strength. It is also, in the case of many, many diseases, a loss of mental acuity. It is a loss of the richness of the inner world that human beings have. One of Hitchens' great passions is writing, and I think it's tremendously admirable that he continues to write, but he worries about the day when his illness will be so far advanced that he will no longer be able to write. And I completely understand where he is coming from with that. He is faced with a tremendous loss of capacity and tremendous suffering in the meantime. And he essentially has to stare it in the face. I will also say that he is being tremendously courageous in his approach, and that indeed he has the right approach toward confronting a terminal illness. He essentially says that he is continuing to hold out for as long as he can. He is holding out while this illness throws everything it has on him, and he is trying to keep as intellectually active as possible. So, in fact, in the way he has personally chosen to address his predicament thus far, Hitchens is a great role model for how people in that situation ought to behave. Not to relinquish their hold on life, not to wish to accelerate death, but try to fight the illness for as long as possible. This entire article strikes a very tragic note. Hitchens writes, for example, "These are progressive weaknesses," referring to his own condition, "that in a more, quote, normal life might have taken decades to catch up with me. But as with the normal life, one finds that every passing day represents more and more, relentlessly subtracted from less and less. In other words, the process both etiolates you and moves you nearer toward death. How could it be otherwise?" And I think this is an excellent summation of the current human predicament, given the current state of medical technology at our disposal. He's absolutely correct. This is indeed the predicament facing all of us, at a slower rate than Hitchens is having to deal with it, certainly, but all of us, absent significant medical intervention, will be faced with this gradual decline in capacities, culminating in the destruction of our very existences. Now, there are several ways to respond to this. I don't subscribe to the tragic worldview, which is the worldview that has been held by most thinkers from antiquity onward, because they felt like they had no other alternative. But that's the worldview that acknowledges the tragedy and essentially resigns oneself to it and attempts to live out one's days in a way with dignity. That is not the view that I hold. My view is the meliorist view. I want to alter whatever conditions in the world exist that are not right, not just, and would lead to this kind of tragedy. So I think Hitchens does a very eloquent job here in pinpointing what the tragedy is. Now the question before us, who will probably have a lot more time than Hitchens himself, is what do we do about it? Do we resign ourselves to the problem, or do we become part of the solution in helping contribute our minds and our efforts in whatever ways we are able to the pursuit of indefinite human life extension, and along the way to the pursuit of cures to a variety of debilitating and deadly diseases. Now, Hitchens cites numerous examples of why it is that having been harmed in this way, facing adversity in this way, is not beneficial to the individual, why this kind of suffering doesn't necessarily have the redeeming characteristic of making the individual stronger. And it's very interesting because it, I think, dovetails nicely with one of the thoughts I have frequently had about the idea that adversity can build character. Many people see individuals coming out of adversity, and they see these individuals as having particularly strong wills or great virtues in other respects, and they think that having endured that adverse experience somehow fortified those individuals' characters and built up their wills. I would say that's a mistake of correlation for causation. My view has always been quite different, and that is that it's not adversity that builds character. It is that pre-existing character enables individuals to better overcome adversity. So people of both stronger character and weaker character can be faced with very adverse situations. The people with stronger character already pre-existing will overcome the adverse situation. The people with pre-existing weaker character will be crushed by it. And so the only people you see essentially surviving the adverse circumstances are the people with stronger character. And that's how the correlation arises. But I do think it's a mistake to suggest that, for instance, physical hardship or deprivation or emotional abuse or torment or poverty can improve a human being. Sure, there might be some coincidental side benefits, some chance insights that one gleans from that state of hardship that one wouldn't have gleaned just because one would have been in a different place, in a different environment. But those kinds of serendipitous benefits by no means outweigh the tremendous suffering that these human beings have to go through. And I think this leads to a very common sense realization that bad things are bad for you. And when a bad thing happens to you, there is typically not going to be enough good that comes out of it for it to be beneficial on net. It's clearly the case with many debilitating illnesses, but I think the same case can be made for other phenomena in our society. For instance, with bullying. A lot of people, particularly in older generations, seem to think that being bullied is just a normal, natural part of growing up and interacting with one's peers, because it helps people deal with adversity, it helps people learn how to deal with others who aren't particularly friendly, and so forth. And these justifications for bullying, or at least excuses for bullying, are couched in these kinds of nice euphemisms. But in reality, I think bullying can scar the minds of hundreds of thousands and millions of young children, and essentially perpetuate, in many ways, the cycle of bullying as it extends to subsequent generations. So I think the insight that bad things are bad for you can be extrapolated into so many arenas of human activity. Hitchens does a very good job when it comes to severe illness. But there is one example that he cites where I would have a very different interpretation from his own. It seems that Hitchens, at least to a great extent, endorses the perspective of Professor Sidney Hook, who died in 1989. Sidney Hook was a pragmatist, materialist, atheist philosopher who essentially suffered quite severely while he was being brought back from the brink of death. And Hitchens summarizes Hook's experience. Here's what Hook says, and is quoted by Hitchens as saying, "I lay at the point of death. A congestive heart failure was treated for diagnostic purposes by an angiogram that triggered a stroke. Violent and painful hiccups, uninterrupted for several days and nights, prevented the ingestion of food. My left side and one of my vocal cords became paralyzed. Some form of pleurisy set in, and I felt I was drowning in a sea of slime. In one of my lucid intervals, during those days of agony, I asked my physician to discontinue all life-supporting services or show me how to do it." Now this is Hitchens writing. "The physician denied this plea, loftily assuring Hook that, quote, someday I would appreciate the unwisdom of my request. But the Stoic philosopher, from the vantage point of continued life, still insisted that he wished he had been permitted to expire. He gave 3 reasons. Another agonizing stroke had hit him, forcing him to suffer it all over again. His family was being put through a hellish experience. Medical resources were being pointlessly expended." In the course of his essay, he used a potent phrase to describe the position of others who suffer like this, referring to them as lying on, quote, mattress graves. So that, in a nutshell, is Hooke's account and what Hitchens perceives the lessons of that account to be. Hitchens ends his narrative about Hooke by essentially saying, if being restored to life doesn't count as something that doesn't kill you, then what does? And there seems no meaningful sense in which it made Sidney Hooke, quote, stronger. So I agree that Sidney Hooke was not made stronger by his experiences. Indeed, by any objective standard, these experiences were quite terrible. But I think Hooke, in particular, misunderstood that the situation he was in, however terrible it might have been, was actually a great thing compared to the alternative, which is death. Hooke acknowledged in his writing that his condition would not have been possible but for the advanced medicine of his time, which clearly would be more advanced today than it was in the late 1980s. However, Hooke himself lamented that this advanced medicine just brought on more suffering. My perspective is very different. It gave him more time. It gave him more time to remain alive in this world, to remain an individual, and to essentially try to leave some sort of legacy, at the very least, or to contribute something to the world and to his own life. So clearly he could create a written account, just as Hitchens can right now. And without that written account, whether or not I agree with all of its contents, I think the world would have been deprived. That is to say, in accord with my view that when a person dies, an entire universe, an entire internal world is extinguished. Because Hooke was able to be alive for a little longer, his internal world continued to exist for a bit longer, and we got to see its products. Now, with regard to the three arguments that Hooke gave, the first one is he could suffer another stroke in the future. Well, that's true. That's true, that potentiality certainly existed. But in a way, that kind of argument could be made for all of us. That is to say, in our futures, any one of us could suffer something horrible. Any of thousands of horrible accidents or diseases or disorders could be inflicted on us. Is that a reason to wish to have died at any time in the past? I don't think so. So one should think of these kinds of future potentials of debilitating disease or injury, any sort of debilitating and painful condition, as a future adverse event to try to either prevent, or if it can't be altogether prevented, to mitigate its consequences. And if its consequences can't be mitigated, then to persevere through it. Not because it'll make you stronger to persevere through it, but because if you persevere, at least some of you will be left at the other end. His second argument is that his family was being subjected to a hellish experience. Well, again, what is the alternative? The alternative is that he would be dead, and his family would have no opportunity to spend any time with him. His family would have no opportunity to benefit from his existence at all. I mean, what would one's relatives rather have if they really care about the individual? Would they rather have that individual or the mere assurance that that individual isn't, quote, suffering anymore? I think those who really care about a person would care about having that person, especially if that person can be in a mentally lucid state for as long as possible, because that's an opportunity to share some time with that individual and to perhaps even get to know that individual a bit more than his relatives had done in the past. And his third argument is that medical resources were being pointlessly expended. Well, I beg to differ here. What is the point of medical resources if not to prolong human lives? So if medical resources are being devoted to prolonging a human life, to bringing a person back from the brink of death, even if this person is quite elderly or frail or has a high risk of succumbing to another condition, that's still a very important use of medical resources. And no person should be denied the ability to benefit from those resources just because that person is vulnerable to other perils. Clearly, these resources do not stand at a higher level of moral priority than actual human lives. Now, Hooke could, if he were still alive, retort to this argument by saying, well, but all the money that was spent on me could have been spent on much younger people, people with greater possible life expectancies if they had been cured of their debilitating conditions. Or he would have said, well, these resources could have been put to better uses, more permanent uses, than helping keep a very old and sick man alive for a few more months. I would respond to that argument by saying that while, of course, I think each individual has the right to refuse treatment if that individual is in a fully mentally cogent state, which Hooke was not at the time that his physician refused his request. It's still the case that the life of every individual is of incalculable moral value. So one cannot make this utilitarian comparison of saying, well, because person X will only live a few months if he's given this life-saving treatment, but person Y would live for 60 years if he were given the life-saving treatment that could be bought with the same resources, then it necessarily follows that one should deny the treatment to person X, ideally by person X renouncing it voluntarily, and then give it to person Y. First of all, that suggests that there's some intercomparability in the values of individual human lives. And when we're talking about innocent human beings, however one might define that, but human beings, for instance, who haven't committed vicious murders or comparable crimes, I don't think there's a legitimate moral way to say that in any circumstance the sacrifice of one innocent person's life is worth it to, quote, save the life of another innocent person. But I don't even think we have to go that far. I think it's sufficient to identify that whole line of argument as a false alternative. The idea is it's not the case that expending medical resources to save the life of another person will necessarily deprive those resources from being used to save the life of another. Because, in reality is much more complex. And resources are not just this homogeneous lump that can be spread in any proportions to any number of people just by the will of some central planner or some philosopher who thinks, well, this is the optimal use of the resources, so we'll divide them this way. No, the resources are highly particularized. They're particular both in terms of what they are, for instance, what sorts of medical instruments are available, what sorts of cures are available to what particular diseases. So, for instance, if there's a 20-year-old out there suffering from an illness, and then there's an 89-year-old out there who's suffering from a different illness, it may well be that the resources are on hand to cure the 89-year-old's illness, but not the 20-year-old's illness, because they're different diseases, and the 89-year-old's illness happens to be better understood by medical science and better managed. So by helping that 89-year-old, you're not somehow depriving the 20-year-old of a cure. That cure wouldn't have been there irrespective of what happened to the 89-year-old. And another way in which medical resources are particularized is in terms of time and place. Where and when are they available? If at the particular hospital where Sidney Hook was, these medical resources were on hand, they couldn't have just effortlessly been deployed to save the life of another person. It would either be save Sidney Hook, or those resources would be idle. And sure, there were people dying all over the world at the same time as Sidney Hook had his brush with death. But so what? It's terrible, it's tragic, but the particular machines and drugs that saved Hook couldn't have just been redeployed to help those people. So, thinking in these cosmic terms about, well, wouldn't it have been better if the medical resources spent on one person would have been spent on another person instead, ignores all of the practical realities of the real world. And those practical realities, what Friedrich Hayek called the circumstances of time and place, combine in myriad ways to prevent these kinds of simplistic alternatives from ever being relevant to actual choices that actual human beings have to make. In the real world, and I know that this is quite an ambitious statement to make, but I think the complexity of the real world does bear it out. It is never necessary to sacrifice one person to save another person. And I'm making an empirical statement here. It is never necessary to do that because with reality being as complex as it is, there is always another way. There is always a way to save both. If you just think hard enough about it, even though most of the time you don't even have to do that, the many alternative solutions are quite readily apparent. So, having dispensed with these kinds of arguments, I think there may have been a more primary motive for Hook to have responded the way he did, and that is he was in terrible pain, and he wanted the pain to stop. And he asked the doctor to end his suffering. On an emotional level, one can certainly understand where he was coming from. The question is that a desire that is consistent with a fully cogent, rational evaluation of what it means to be a living human being? Hook was an atheist and a materialist, so he clearly didn't believe in an afterlife. So he clearly didn't see some good outcome to the cessation of his life. He wouldn't be going to heaven in his own view, for instance. So, in that view, because I share his atheism and materialism, the cessation of the existence of the individual is the worst possible outcome. It is the elimination of the self. It is the inability to even conceive of anything in the world. Not just the future, but also the past. It is the erasure of all of one's memories. And that seems to me, in fact, it is my strong conviction that this is the case. That seems to me to be a much worse fate than any amount of pain. Because after suffering his pain, and the terrible uncertainty, of course, that came even after he was temporarily cured, Hook could still write, he could still think, he could still act as himself for a while, and he eventually succumbed to death, very unfortunately and tragically. But I think it's a very good result that he was able to live those extra few months. And the longer he would have been able to live, the better. I wish the same for Hitchens. And I think in this particular respect, perhaps the applications of Hitchens' thesis deserve some revision. It's true. There are many things that won't kill you, at least not right away, but will not make you stronger by any stretch of the imagination. The solution is not to wish for death, ever. The solution is to fight against any of these adverse events and to try to reverse as many of them as is possible. And if it's not possible at the present time, at least to try to hold out until a reversal could be accomplished. Either do that or die trying, literally. What does one have to lose that is as great as the only life that an individual can ever have? And this internal world, this entire universe within one's mind, is the most precious attribute of any individual. It is the highest value of them all. And to let it be snuffed out for anything, because of pain or because of suffering or because of a misguided philosophical argument, is the greatest tragedy that I can imagine. 2 famous men died last week. One was a great thinker, the other a vile dictator and despicable thug. This will not be an obituary for either of them. Kim Jong-il did not deserve an obituary, and Christopher Hitchens would have preferred a different treatment. I was shocked by Hitchens's sudden death from pneumonia, as he had just days before published his Trial of the Will, an essay that strongly suggested that he had at least several months of life left in him. But such is the fundamental injustice of death, a horror that indiscriminately visits even the best of us. Instead of an obituary, I offer today a discussion of one of Hitchens's ideas, helping in this way to keep his thought alive, as he would surely have wished. I will try here to generalize from Hitchens's observations and take them a bit further, in the interests of continuing the intellectual conversation. In 2010, Hitchens published a powerful article in Slate titled "A Nation of Racist Dwarfs," discussing his unique and insightful impressions of some overlooked elements of North Korean totalitarianism. What struck Hitchens about North Korea under Kim Jong-il was not the so-called communism of its regime, but rather its racist and nationalist bigotry. Hitchens noted that this was entirely consistent with the totalitarian mentality of Kim Jong-il, because in Hitchens's words, nothing is more total than racist nationalism. Hitchens rightly pointed out that race arrogance and nationalist hysteria are powerful cements for the most odious systems, no matter what those systems call themselves. For all his theoretical flaws, Karl Marx was an internationalist. He wanted an international socialism that transcended national or ethnic allegiances, hence the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." Marx even opposed the emerging welfare statism of Otto von Bismarck and Benjamin Disraeli, on the grounds that it would appease too many people through superficial wealth redistribution, while hindering the true international workers' revolution that Marx and Friedrich Engels saw as the wave of the future. But the mentality of top-down central planning, that of the dictatorship of the proletariat, infected Marxist thought in the early 20th century, particularly through the ideology of Lenin and Stalin. The path down which North Korea has gone is a logical conclusion of that central planning mindset. It is utter desolation combined with xenophobic ultranationalism. There can be no internationalism, no cosmopolitanism, no progress for all human beings under central planning. Those who try to homogenize and dictate the economy will inevitably come to homogenize and dictate the culture, and will have no tolerance for dissent or substantive difference in either realm. Furthermore, Hitchens's observations confirm that the central planning mentality cannot produce the prodigious new socialist man conceived by Trotsky. It can only create stunted bigots. As I expressed previously in The Perils of Cultural Homogeneity, Any attempts to impose one uniform lifestyle or ideology upon a people will result in the rule of a few entrenched elites. Kim Jong-il and his oligarchy of cronies were an extreme example of this more general principle. There can never be a true dictatorship of the proletariat. There can only be a dictatorship of a handful of perverse parasites, ruling in the name of the proletariat, gradually shedding even that pretense in favor of cultivating outright leader worship in the general population. The legacy of Kim Jong-il has been to show just how far into the depths of depravity the central planning homogenizing mindset can plunge an entire society of human beings. The legacy of Christopher Hitchens has been to stand out as a light of reason and friend of liberty, an incisive observer of evil and a champion of its antidote, the individual creator, the indomitable human spirit that alas can be killed, but that can never be truly conquered by tyranny. It saddens me that Christopher Hitchens died a few days too early to see the news of Kim Jong-il's demise. But, given the secretive practices of North Korean news media, there is a good chance that Hitchens actually outlived the dictator, and we just did not find out about Kim's death for several days. Regardless, a window of opportunity has now arisen in North Korea, and I sincerely hope that the political instability there will lead to a regime collapse, a breath of freedom, and an opening up to the world. Maybe someday, future generations of North Koreans will be reading Hitchens and shaking their heads at their country's abysmal past. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. The video Afterlife is a compilation of remarks by Seth Andrews, YouTube user The Thinking Atheist, and other famous YouTube atheists regarding the religious concept of life after death. However, the video goes beyond merely correctly critiquing ideas of the afterlife and reflects an unfortunate acceptance of human mortality itself. As a lifelong atheist and transhumanist, a resolute foe of senescence and death and seeker of indefinite life extension, I offer my critiques of the statements and quotations made in this video. The video does present many interesting and valid insights, but it unfortunately throws the metaphorical baby, indefinite human life extension, driven by scientific discoveries and technological innovation, out with the bathwater, religious myths of an afterlife unsubstantiated by evidence and arising out of a desire to attain comfort in the face of mortality. As much as I respect Mr. Andrews and others quoted here, I must regretfully conclude that afterlife embraces the other side of the religious coin. The premise that the only way to try to beat back the alleged inevitability of one's eventual non-existence is through an unsubstantiated fantasy. But there is another, fully secular, fully human-centered option. The progress of our civilization and its eventual ability to conquer the age-old and old age perils plaguing humankind. I would welcome an in-depth discussion with Mr. Andrews or any of the other commentators in the video regarding this alternative to the religious afterlife, an alternative that can affirm and extend the precious only life that each of us has. I hope that more atheists can recognize that transhumanism is the logical implication of rejecting a teleological, theistic worldview and amplifying all that is best about us as humans, so that the purpose of the universe can be what we make of it. The video begins with a quote by Vladimir Nabokov, who wrote that although the two are identical twins, man as a rule views the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one he is heading for at some 4,500 heartbeats an hour. I respond that in the so-called prenatal abyss, one has never been alive, so one does not know what one is missing, or that one is missing, in fact. But once one is alive, one is able to anticipate one's own non-existence, which is the worst fate of all for an individual, worse than eternal torture or eternal boredom, neither of which is realistic in any case. Furthermore, when one is alive, one has the ability to discover the history that came before one's time. One has no way of knowing or observing the future after one's death. Another quotation appears in the video from Mark Twain, who wrote, "I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it." I answer that being dead presupposes having once been alive. Having never existed makes one a mere potential among trillions of possible beings. Having existed once, but not anymore, means that one's entire self, a fully formed universe of memories, sensations, thoughts, and aspirations, has become snuffed out. For each of us, there was a time when we did not have all that we have now, our lives. But now that we have it, to lose it would be intolerable. It would literally be the undoing of everything we have ever been, or done, or aspired toward. Dark Matter 2525 says that the universe would continue in its ways if humanity weren't here to witness it. True, but to the individual, it is the same as if the entire universe has been extinguished. Whatever goes on after one's death, one cannot experience it or be aware of its existence, and hence, the only significance it might have is in terms of one's anticipation of how it might be. That anticipation can only take place while one is alive, and is necessarily fraught with extreme uncertainty. It cannot compare to the real thing, to living in the future. I want to live a millennium from now, not merely speculate about how it might be. Healthy Addict says that the universe is absolutely massive, and we are virtually insignificant in it. I respond that the vastness of the universe in no way diminishes the significance of the individual. What is valuable, what is important, is a function of entities that can pursue values or make judgments of importance. Only living, conscious entities can actively pursue values, and the very idea of values only makes sense in the context of the survival and flourishing of such living, conscious entities. The universe is vast, but the lives of humans and possibly other sentient beings are still of the ultimate importance, since it is the human scale on which valuation occurs. Size and importance are not related. Another sense of the term insignificance might simply be powerlessness or vulnerability, without a moral judgment attached. It is true that humanity is still in its infancy, and still extremely fragile. Numerous natural disasters originating on Earth or in outer space could severely damage or destroy our species, but this should only motivate us to expand our sphere of influence through technology and its application to the colonization of space and the enhancement of our bodies. If we are weak relative to the inanimate forces of the universe, then we must become stronger as individuals and as a species. YouTube user Evidence says, "I see no evidence that the rest of the universe cares that we exist, or is even capable of caring, but I don't really need validation from the rest of the universe to find my own life important." And I agree. There is no teleology built into the universe. What this means is that we must do our own caring. We cannot rely on the universe as a crutch, except in that we should utilize the laws of nature as instruments to advance our well-being. It is up to us to protect ourselves and expand our sphere of influence in the universe, and we should all, like evidence, find our own lives important, which is precisely why we should make every effort to prolong our lives, which are the source of that ultimate importance for us. Lacey Green says, "It's absurd to me how many people live for dying. I agree that it is wrong to live for dying, or to anticipate that one's individuality and vantage point into the world will persist after one's physical body is destroyed. Rather than live for dying, one should live for living, and act to keep on living. To do so, one should support, at least morally, the emerging efforts to prolong human lifespans. One should also educate oneself about the possibility of indefinite life extension within the coming decades, as well as developments that are occurring today to help bring this goal closer to reality. There's an abundance of information out there on this topic, and about the very real ongoing efforts to achieve indefinite life extension in humans." Seth Andrews says, "I think fragile, fearful humans were terrified of death, and so they wrote their own ending to the story. This happy fantasy, a place where they'll be reunited with people they've lost, they'll experience constant joy, and of course they'll never ever die." I respond that this is indeed the predominant motivation behind the origins of religion. People who could not hope to avoid death through technology sought to comfort themselves and to make everyday pursuits more tolerable by convincing themselves that their existence does not cease at death. In effect, religion is ersatz immortality, a poor substitute for the real thing, but enough to trick many people into not realizing the grave implications of death. But in an era when technology is advancing so rapidly that there is hope for us and our contemporaries to live indefinitely, there are two main attitudinal dangers. The first danger is continuing to believe that the ersatz immortality is good enough and that it justifies not striving hard for the real thing. The second is the other side of that same coin, unfortunately embraced by too many atheists, rejecting both the ersatz immortality and the real thing, abandoning the most profound triumph of our species when we are in historical time on the verge of achieving it. I support abandoning the fantasy, but I do not support relinquishing the reality, literally, and acquiescing to becoming food for worms. D.P.R. Jones says that the concept of an afterlife diminishes the value that we place on our lives and the here and now. I agree that this could be the case, if the expectation of an afterlife discourages people from striving to both improve and prolong this life. As an atheist, I hold that this life is the only one there is, and indeed, it is the most precious life there is and could be. Therefore, to lose this life is to lose everything. And so, the foremost ethical objective should be to hold on to this life. Dark Matter 2525 says, "An unlimited supply of anything, including life, means that its existence cannot be appreciated." I say, for all practical purposes, the air on Earth is inexhaustible by humans. Does that mean that we do not appreciate the ability to breathe and sustain our lives in that way? Does this mean that air is not essential to us, or any less important to our lungs than if we had to ration it or purchase canisters of oxygen to carry around? Certainly not. While scarcity of a resource is a key determinant of its monetary price, the idea that scarcity is somehow necessary for mental appreciation is highly flawed. Use value, or utility, and monetary value, or price, are not the same. We should and can appreciate a thing or a condition for its own qualities qua thing or condition, and the benefit those qualities confer upon us. How many of those things or conditions exist or are going to exist does not matter. Furthermore, the fact is, we still live one moment at a time. We do not have all of eternity at our disposal at any given moment, no matter how long we live. We only have the given moment, and a limited range of possibilities for what we can do right then. Thus, a kind of temporal scarcity will always exist, in the sense that some activities and satisfactions will always be more remote in time than others, and we will have to wait and strive for the ones that are more remote. Dark Matter 2525 continues that if life is eternal, then there should be no sense of urgency. I respond that value is not derived from urgency, but from improvement of the human condition, and subsequently from enjoyment of the fruits of that improvement. A work of art or music is not any more beautiful because of the urgency with which we experience it. It is beautiful because of its intrinsic constituent characteristics, the brushstrokes and notes that comprise it. Indeed, urgency detracts from value by inducing a stressed, rushed, crazed, and hectic experience where we miss important aspects of life because we worry that we will not have the time to do whatever we consider to be higher on the priority list. With less urgency, we could partake of more of the good things in life and have a longer-term perspective, planning for the future and treating ourselves and others with more respect and consideration. We could be more frugal, since we would enjoy the fruits of saving directly. We could take better care of our living spaces, both locally in our homes and on the scale of planets. We could still fulfill all of our highest priorities, and more of them too, since we would have more time. But longevity itself would reshape our priorities and enable us to gain a more balanced, deliberate, and sophisticated perspective on our lives. For me, the greatest happiness comes from those serene moments where I do not have to rush anywhere and do not have to worry about falling behind. It comes from having accomplished and from having done something good that could later, with purpose and deliberation, be the stepping stone for something even better. In the midst of intense work, happiness is that plateau of leisure between the past and the future, the reaffirmation that life can be good when it amounts to a progress that never hits a permanent wall. Urgency detracts from happiness by preventing one from truly enjoying life in a leisurely fashion, as opposed to trying to cram in as much as possible now, expecting, fearing perhaps, that there might not be much time left. Thunderfoot says, "I do not fear being dead, but the concept of the alternatives offered by the religious do trouble me. He says regarding heaven, there does appear to be one constant. It will last for eternity. Imagine that. Imagine eternity." He continues that the first 100 years may be possible, the first 1,000 more painful, the first 10,000 insufferable. But this is just the start. He says an eternity in heaven would be hell for me. I agree that heaven, as imagined by the religious, would probably be a somewhat uninteresting place, since one would spend all of one's time in it glorifying God. But this problem has nothing to do with experiencing an indefinite existence. It is a great poverty of imagination to be unable to think of what one could do with 10,000 years, or a much longer time frame. Think, could you even consume all of the literature, music, art, and culture that humankind has created up to the present if you had 10,000 years? Indefinite longevity would bring about unprecedented richness, depth, and breadth of experience, as well as the immensity of individual learning and refinement, and the possibility to pursue multiple careers and many more hobbies than one currently can. Furthermore, if Thunderfoot dislikes the prospect of an eternal existence, why would an eternal non-existence be any better or more preferable? Once you are dead forever, and you cannot choose to go back to not being dead. On the other hand, if you are alive indefinitely and you feel tired, you could choose to take a nice long non-lethal nap or vacation and resume your activities when you are refreshed and in a better mood. Those who feel tedium or boredom now might later feel more like finding something meaningful and interesting to do in this vast universe. To die is to deny oneself this ability for an improvement in one's outlook and enthusiasm. The great and all too common error made by Thunderfoot is to see all of an individual's life as a simultaneous totality, rather than the way it is actually experienced, one moment at a time. While Thunderfoot might be unable to conceive of what he would do with 10,000 years, he probably knows what he would like to do the next minute, or the next day, or the next week. If he could live and work in this way, experiencing one day at a time, while remaining at his physical and intellectual prime, would there ever be a day when he would consciously decide that he would rather die tomorrow? Only a person in tremendous suffering could conceivably make such a choice. With technological and moral progress taking away ever more of that suffering, the desire to keep on living should become strengthened until no sane, rational person would ever want to die. Dark Matter 2525 says, given eternity, anything that can be accomplished will be accomplished. Beyond all achievements, there would only be limitless, pointless existence. I respond that considering that over 1,000 new books get produced every day, doing or accomplishing, quote, everything, would be impossible, since our mind's conception of the possibilities will always outpace our ability to actualize those possibilities. Dark Matter 2525 is assuming a finite static set of possible accomplishments. In reality, the scope of possible accomplishments and activities grows every day at a much faster rate than any given human has the ability to pursue those accomplishments and activities. One cannot experience today all that has been created even today by the billions of people now alive. The longer we live, the smaller will be the fraction of available pursuits in which we will be able to engage at any given time. Even if humans are able to enhance their minds radically in order to process and memorize as much text as a computer can, the human creative faculty would be able to generate proportionally more text as well, so that the volume of available output would still accelerate away from the ability of any human to process all of it. And books are just one subset of human activity, which will become increasingly diverse and multifaceted as our civilization advances. And think of all those billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, that we have yet to explore and colonize. Lacey Green says, when I think about my own death, I used to feel scared, but I don't think I do anymore. I hypothesize, though I cannot be sure, that Ms. Green only sees death in the abstract for now. She is young and healthy, and it is easy to rationalize away the significance of death when it is remote. This is a coping mechanism that many people have, and it works particularly well when everyday life is reasonably good. But how many people can have this equanimity when death approaches, when it is too late to do anything about it? If Ms. Green does not wish to experience fear regarding the prospect of her eventual death, fine. I have no problem with people choosing to focus on other matters in an everyday context. However, I sincerely wish that she and others who do not feel scared would nonetheless have an intellectual awareness of the great destruction wrought by senescence, decay, and death. Then they could, calmly or cheerfully as they please, support research and advance moral arguments that assist humankind in beating back this menace. I advocate not fear, but action. Aaron Ra says, I'm not afraid of being dead. After we die, we will not know the truth at that point. We will not know, wish, think, remember, dream, anything. Precisely. And that is the worst possible fate. Our very being, our I-ness, that which makes all other experiences possible, will be extinguished, and not even the memory of our once having existed will remain with us. This is why death is so terrible. But Seth Andrews says, I don't really find this sad or tragic either. I don't really welcome death, but I don't live in fear of the end. And I've come to see it as just another part of the natural world. I respond that not all that is natural is good, and indeed nature offers ways out of the problem of senescence by showing us numerous species that do not experience the ravages of biological aging, or experience them at a much slower rate than we do. Since in its truest sense the word natural is just an expression for what is, Mr. Andrews is committing the Panglossian fallacy, the view that whatever is right. Cancer is natural, and it is brutal. Also natural is the fact that 99.9% of all the species that ever existed are now extinct. Just because this is natural does not mean that we should accept it for ourselves. We can remake the outcomes of nature by studying the laws of nature and harnessing them for our own benefit. Once we have secured our continuing existence, we can work to eventually create a more humane, less predatory environment for all life forms that deserve it. We already do this to some extent with domestic pets and certain other useful animals, though arguably not to the extent that a more morally developed and resource-rich society might accommodate. Thunderfoot says, "In some respects we never die. Our lives are entangled with those who come after us, just as our lives are entangled with those who came before us." He says that Faraday, Newton, and Pasteur affect everyone's lives today. He continues that death is not the end. We are intertwined with both lesser and greater things. It is true that our lives have an impact on others, and that impact can extend beyond the lifespan of an individual. It is also true that we sometimes do not even perceive all the ways in which we impact others, and others impact us. However, while our influence on the rest of the world might be a source of pride or reassurance to us in life, in death it means nothing, because we would not be aware of it even as a general concept without any particular details. Others who remain alive might still hazily and incompletely remember the dead individual, of course, but that memory is an asset to them, not to the dead. I benefit from the existence of Faraday, Newton, and Pasteur. Good for me. But they are oblivious to this at present. Lacey Green says, "Just because there is no grand scheme it plays into, does not mean that there is not something beautiful about what is going on here." I agree that the universe, or existence, has no grand scheme, but it is not clear to what, quote, beautiful phenomena Ms. Green is referring. There is true beauty in existence, but there are also true nastiness and cruelty and injustice. It is important to recognize the beautiful and good elements of the world while struggling to eradicate or reform the bad. As I wrote and spoke before on this channel, the real war we must fight is against the forces of ruin, and we should not lapse into the Panglossian fallacy of accepting absolutely anything that occurs on a regular basis as somehow, quote, beautiful, or even remotely palatable. Zomgitz Chris says, "Ironically, the only part of me that is immortal is my material body. Every atom of me will be recycled back into the universe." A long time ago, when I was 14, I tried to find consolation in that idea as well. It worked for about 2 hours. But then I realized that what matters is the arrangement of those atoms and the temporal continuity of that arrangement. I gain and lose atoms all the time, but each individual atom is not what makes me who I am. The essence of who I am, rather, is the manner in which those atoms interact with one another within the overall structure of my body, including my mind. When that is gone, I am gone. Dark Matter 2525 says, "Even though a cell might not last forever, the role it plays in the larger organism is important, and that is how I see myself, as part of something bigger." I say, if that something bigger does not care about Dark Matter 2525, by his own earlier admission, why should he care about it enough to be willing to be a mere cog in it? And if, as Lacey Green says, there's no grand scheme to it all, then what exactly is he a part of? In terms of purpose, the only alternative to a teleological worldview where purpose is built into the universe is a humanistic worldview, where purpose originates from the self, based on the biological requirements of one's own survival, which, once sustained at a certain level, enable the individual to use his will to shape the universe to give it purpose. But in order to confer purpose upon an initially purposeless cosmos, one has to exist, and to keep existing. Once existence stops, the purpose-giving process also stops, and so the something bigger is also no more. Zomgitz Chris says, "Knowing that this life is the only one I have makes me a lot more conscious of my actions, and makes me want to do something with this short life I have." I agree that knowing that this is the only life we have should make this life the greatest value to us, to be treated with the utmost seriousness and respect. We should seek to do great things with our time, but we should also seek to prolong our time, which is in itself a monumental and glorious undertaking. Seth Andrews concludes, "There's too much to learn, too much to see, too much to know, too much to experience. I'm not just going to exist, I'm going to live." I say certainly, some conditions of existence are better than others. And mere survival is not all that there is to life. Flourishing can occur when life is lived in a way that fulfills an increasingly sophisticated series of human needs, ranging on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from basic material sustenance to self-actualization. But pursuing the higher needs by no means undercuts or conflicts with the more basic needs. Indeed, the higher needs are largely unattainable unless one also already lives in a prosperous, peaceful civilization where the basic needs are so easily fulfilled that one almost takes them for granted. All too many people perceive survival as somehow antithetical to enjoying life, but in fact, enjoyment of life is not possible without being alive. Therefore, if one wishes to do more of the things that make life enjoyable, one should strive to live as long as possible, far beyond the paltry 80 or so years that comprise the current average life expectancy in the Western world. So those are my thoughts on the afterlife video, and I welcome any responses from the commentators I have cited here, as well as the opportunity to engage in further discussion, and hopefully convince more atheists that transhumanism and indefinite life extension are indeed the way to go for those who reject the idea of any sort of existence beyond this one. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. So the year 2012 is coming to a conclusion, and the year 2013 is about to begin. Happy New Year. The sensible ones among us knew all along that this would be the case, that there would not be an end of the world or end of humanity on December 21st, 2012, or on any other date. It always astonishes me, though, how many people fall for these nonsense apocalyptic prophecies. And this December 21st prophecy was particularly egregious because it was fueled by the mainstream media, who, by highlighting these predictions, which had absolutely no scientific evidence whatsoever, not only that, predictions which didn't even have any evidence in the Mayan calendar on which they relied, but so many people fell for them. And furthermore, what is dangerous about these predictions is that the people who fall for them change the way they lead their lives, sometimes to the point of overtly harming themselves or their loved ones, threatening to kill themselves, threatening to kill their children, sometimes even attempting to do so, as was the case with the previous end-of-the-world prediction by Harold Camping, a fundamentalist, quote, prophet, who had been repeatedly wrong with his predictions and continued to persist until he lost all credibility, as he should have. But I think the damage of end-of-the-world predictions is even deeper and even more insidious, even for the people who don't commit outright acts of harm based on these predictions, they result in a change in mentality. Because for human beings to behave prudently, for human beings to plan in the long term for the future, to act in a way that conserves their own lives and respects the lives of others, there needs to be an expectation that life will continue in a certain manner. If that expectation is absent, if one believes that the end of the world is imminent, that nothing will matter very shortly, then that is an excuse for an individual to lose all sense of self-restraint, to lose all sense of responsibility for his or her future, and to have greatly diminished respect for other people. This, as a matter of fact, is the exact opposite argument from the ones that opponents of indefinite life extension make. Those opponents would claim that the only reason why life is worth living is because it's finite, or because it's of short duration, so it inspires a sense of urgency in people. But we see with these individuals who believe the apocalyptic predictions that exactly the opposite outcome occurs, that these people become very short-sighted, that these people seek very immediate kinds of gratifications without any regard for the long-term consequences for their health, for their financial well-being, for their relationships with other people. On the other hand, if you take the opposite situation, when a person has many years, decades, hopefully centuries to look forward to, that person will be prudent and far-sighted and will think about the implications of his or her actions many, many years and decades and centuries into the future. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the way life ought to be lived. Because every single moment is transient. What we do now, what we experience now, what we enjoy now, will be in the past very soon. The way to lead the good life is to find some way to enjoy it sustainably, and find some way to spend it in a worthwhile fashion all throughout its duration. That means now, that means in the near future, that means in the far future. And if we have a far future to look forward to, we're going to be thinking about how to make it better. And we're going to try to prevent some of the calamities and some of the inconveniences that might come along down the road. Now, I didn't just want to confine this video to apocalyptic predictions, because the patent silliness of these kinds of predictions that the world will end on X date is apparent, I think, to any rational thinker. And that includes not only secular thinkers like myself and many among you, it would also include the more sensible among the religious thinkers. The people who predict the end of the world on a particular date might be opposed by other religious thinkers, even religious thinkers who believe that there will someday be an end of the world, but think, for instance, that it would be arrogant to presume that one knows when that's going to happen, or that one can predict the will of God. I have heard that argument in my discussions with some of my Christian friends, and I can respect them for that, because that's a position that's closer to reality than a position that just arbitrarily posits some sort of cutoff date beyond which humanity will cease to exist. At least, it is certainly a mark of a more robust intellectual system to posit that there may be an end of the world, but one doesn't know when it's going to happen, than to say that there is going to definitely be an end of the world on some easily falsifiable occasion. Still, I would take it a step further and say, I do not believe that there is ever going to be an end of the world. I do not think that humanity will ever cease to exist. I do not think that our civilization will ever come to an end. And I say this not with 100% certainty. I say this with about 99.99% certainty. And really, I want to make it clear that there are sources of existential risk for human beings. I do think, however, that the origin of these sources is often misunderstood, and the misunderstood origins are often, unfortunately, overblown by a lot of commentators. People who thrive on sensation, people who want to, by having these glaring doomsday predictions, from a secular point of view, they might want to earn a following by making those predictions. They might want to call attention to themselves. And really, if their predictions fail, they might be humiliated, but some of them, like Paul Ehrlich of the population bomb fame, who made Malthusian predictions about human overpopulation in the late 1960s and early 70s and has been consistently demonstrated to be wrong, well, some of them aren't even really that humiliated. Paul Ehrlich continues to be held in high esteem in many circles, unfortunately, even though all of his predictions have shown to be completely wrong. But many people think that existential risk is going to exist in the future to a much greater extent than it has existed to date. And I have a completely different view on this. The greatest existential risk has nothing to do with human beings. It has everything to do with the natural world as untouched by human beings. So, for instance, 99.9% of all the species that have ever existed to date are now extinct. And most of those extinctions occurred long before human beings ever came on the scene. Human beings had nothing to do with those extinctions. The dinosaurs, according to the best scientific understanding, were wiped out because of an impact by a meteor. And certainly this can happen again. And that is a major existential risk. However, I think it's an existential risk that can be mitigated or eliminated with human technology, with improved systems to detect asteroids and meteors and comets that are in the Earth's trajectory and to deflect them or eliminate them, or perhaps in the more distant future, capture them and harvest the various precious metals and other minerals that they might contain. That is how humanity can mitigate existential risk. Some existential risks have been caused by human beings, and one of the biggest ones has been nuclear weapons. But the era of greatest existential risk from nuclear weapons is now past. That was the era of the Cold War and the calculus of mutually assured destruction, when it was thought that, well, war between the United States and the Soviet Union, including conventional war, could be prevented if both sides thought that the other side would unleash essentially a man-made end of the world if it were attacked. That mentality had numerous problems. The key problem is the assumption that the other side's intentions were perfectly transparent, and if the other side intended to commit an act of aggression, that signal could be read with 100% clarity by the side that was responding. In fact, there were several very close calls during the Cold War when there was an erroneous understanding of the other side's intentions. And when the Soviet Union was hours away from launching a nuclear attack based on a false alarm. Or if you look back in history to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it took some very high-stakes negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev to prevent a nuclear war based on geopolitical bickering. It's very good that the era of mutually assured destruction is largely behind us. And I think there are certainly steps forward to be taken in terms of getting rid of the major nuclear powers' nuclear stockpiles. But now that there is no longer this persistent geopolitical rivalry and hostility between the United States and Russia, I do not think that that sort of nuclear war is very likely at all. In fact, I would place the probability of its occurrence at near zero. Some have posited that There may be existential risks from the emergence of artificial intelligence or from the emergence of nanotechnology run amok. I do not place much stock in those predictions. And the reason why is because these increasingly sophisticated technologies are going to be designed with increasingly sophisticated controls. With regard to artificial intelligence, I don't see why anybody would design a hostile AI. Rather, I see humanity following along Ray Kurzweil's predicted trajectory, where instead of having distinct human beings as they are right now and artificial intelligences that will eventually become much more effective than human beings, even in the tasks that human beings can uniquely perform today. Instead of that, there will be a kind of merger of the two, in the sense that human brains will increasingly be augmented with AI capacities. Some of the first might be just enhanced computer processing power, computer-like memory so that we can have instantaneous recall of data and the storage of a lot more data than we can keep in our memories right now. And ultimately, that sort of integration will lead us to become many orders of magnitude more effective at thinking and doing than we are today. But there would be no war between human beings and artificial intelligence because they will be one and the same. The greater threat might come from people who resist technological progress and try to crack down on and persecute individuals who support technological development and who try to bring about these innovations. And that might be a very unfortunate time, a tragic time for many. I hope it doesn't happen. I hope that we can prevent it. But it's not going to be the end of the world, and it's not going to be the end of humanity. It will be another historical conflict. With regard to nanotechnology, I do not see why anybody would design a self-replicating nanobot without a kill switch. The nightmare gray goo scenario where the nanobots consume all other matter for their own purposes seems rather inconceivable to me, because no sensible scientist is going to create a machine like that. There may be self-replicating nanobots that self-replicate under very controlled parameters. I think every type of self-replicating nanobot is going to be built with a very intricate system of controls that will disable it even if there's the remotest probability of it running amok. Some people might allege, well, it wouldn't be the reputable scientists who created it, would be madmen, crazy people who want to destroy humankind for some reason or another. All historical experience with those kinds of people suggests that they're not very smart, and if they're desperate, they will use the most obvious approaches to vent their desperation. And sometimes they may be very indiscriminately destructive approaches, but to design a nanobot that is capable of doing what the proponents of this kind of scenario envision takes so much education and intelligence and clear-headedness that these kinds of mindlessly destructive people are not going to be able to bring it about. So I am very optimistic about the long-term future of humankind. Not only is there not going to be a doomsday on any particular date, but my view is human civilization will continue to exist indefinitely with progressive improvements in technology. The key for each of us is to be able to survive up until the time when we can take advantage of these technologies, so that we can belong to the future and not just to the present. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the key challenge. And in the meantime, of course, if there are existential risks that we can identify, we should work to mitigate them. We should work to figure out technological solutions to them. And most importantly, we should not fall for the defeatist doomsday predictions that suggest that either at some specific date in the future or with some high probability in the future, our civilization will come to an end, because those defeatist predictions sap our motivation to pursue improvements to the human condition. And as a final point, some might bring the second law of thermodynamics into the conversation. I have a video about this called Transhumanism and the Second Law of Thermodynamics, where I explain that eventual end of the universe predictions based on the second law of thermodynamics are not in fact valid. They arise from a misunderstanding of the second law of thermodynamics. In any event, ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year! 2013 will fully elapse, just as 2012 has, and may you all live through it in peace and happiness and prosperity. I hope to be able to talk to you again at the end of the next year, and of course, many times before that. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As a libertarian transhumanist, I was rather baffled to see the transhuman megalomania video on the Rocking Philosophy YouTube channel of one Rocking Mr. E. Rocking Philosophy appears to have much in common with my rational individualist outlook in terms of general principles, though not in terms of some specific positions, such as Rocking Mr. E's opposition to LGBT rights. The channel's description states that, quote, above all, Rocking Philosophy promotes individualism and a culture free of coercion. Views are based on the non-aggression principle, realism, and a respect for rationality. I agree with all of these basic principles. Hence my bewilderment that Rocking Mr. E would attempt to assail transhumanism in extremely harsh terms, going so far as to call transhumanism, quote, a mad delusion and a, quote, threat looming over humanity, rather than embrace or promote it. Such characterizations could not be more mistaken. In essays and videos such as Liberty Through Long Life and Libertarian Life Extension Reforms, I explain that libertarianism and transhumanism are natural corollaries and would reinforce one another through a virtuous cycle of positive feedback. If people are indeed free as individuals to innovate and to enter the economic and societal arrangements that they consider beneficial, what do you think would happen to the rate of technological progress? If you think that the result would not be a skyrocketing acceleration of new inventions and their applications to all areas of life, would that position not presuppose a view that freedom would somehow breed stagnation or lead to suboptimal utilization of human creative faculties? In other words, would not the view of libertarianism as being opposed to transhumanism essentially be a view that liberty would hold people back from transcending the limitations involuntarily imposed on them by the circumstances in which they and their ancestors found themselves? How could such a view be reconcilable with the whole point of liberty, which is to expand and, as the term suggests, liberate human potential instead of constricting it? Rocking Mr. E criticizes transhumanists for attempting to reshape the so-called natural condition of humanity and to render such a condition obsolete. Yet this overlooks the essence of human behavior over the past 12 millennia at least. Through the use of technology, from rudimentary hunting and farming implements to airplanes, computers, scientific medicine, and spacecraft, we have already greatly departed from the nasty, brutish, and short so-called natural lives of our Paleolithic ancestors. Furthermore, Rocking Mr. E falls prey to the naturalistic fallacy that the so-called natural, defined arbitrarily as that which has not been shaped by deliberate human influence, is somehow optimal or good, when in fact we know that so-called nature, apart from human influence, is callously indifferent at best and viciously cruel in most circumstances, having brought about the immense suffering and demise of most humans who have ever lived, and the extinction of 99.9% of species that have ever existed, the vast majority of those occurring without any human intervention. Rocking Mr. E characterizes transhumanism as a so-called evil that presents itself as a, quote, morally relativist and benign force where any action can be justified for the greater good. I see neither moral relativism nor any greater good justifications than transhumanism. Transhumanism can be justified from an entirely individualistic standpoint. Furthermore, it can be justified from the morally objective value of each individual's life and the continuation of such life. I, as an individual, do not wish to die, and wish to accomplish more than my current bodily and mental faculties, as well as the current limitations of human societies and the present state of technology, would allow me to accomplish today. I exist objectively, and I recognize that my existence requires objective physical prerequisites, such as the continuation of the functions of my biological body and biological mind. Therefore, I support advances in medicine, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, computing, education, transportation, and human settlement, which would enable these limitations to be progressively lifted and would improve my chances of seeing a much remoter future than my current rate of biological senescence would allow. As an ethically principled individual, I recognize that all beings with the same essential faculties that I have ought also to have the right to pursue these aspirations in an entirely voluntary, non-coercive manner. In other words, individualist transhumanism would indeed lead to the good of all, because its principles and achievements would be universalizable. But the always vaguely defined notion of the so-called greater good does not serve as the justification for transhumanism. The good of every individual does. The good of every individual is equivalent to the good for all individuals, which is the only defensible notion of a greater good. Rocking Mr. E states that some of the technologies advocated by transhumanists are, quote, less dangerous than others, and some are even useful. Interestingly enough, he includes cryopreservation in the category of less dangerous technologies, because a cryopreserved human who is revived will still have the same attributes that he or she had prior to preservation. Life extension is the most fundamental transhumanist aim, the one that makes all the other aims feasible. As such, I am quite surprised that Rocking Mr. E did not devote far more time in his video to technologies of radical life extension. Cryonics is one such approach, which attempts to place a physically damaged organism in stasis after that organism reaches clinical death by today's definition. In the future, what is today considered death may become reversible, giving that individual another chance at life. There are other life extension approaches, however, which would not even require stasis. Aubrey de Grey's SENS approach involves the periodic repair of 7 kinds of damage that contribute to senescence and eventual death. A person who is relatively healthy when he begins to undergo the therapies envisioned by SENS might not ever need to get to the stage where cryopreservation would be the only possible way of saving that person. What does Rocking Mr. E think of that kind of technology? What about the integration of nanotechnology into human bodily repair systems to allow for ongoing maintenance of cells and tissues? If a person still looks, talks, and thinks like many humans do today, but lives indefinitely and remains indefinitely young, would this be acceptable to Rocking Mr. E, or would it be a, quote, megalomaniacal and, quote, evil violation of human nature? Considering that indefinite life extension is the core of transhumanism, the short shrift given to it in Rocking Mr. E's video underscores the severe deficiencies of his critique. Rocking Mr. E further supports megascale engineering, including the creation of giant spacecraft and space elevators, as a type of technology that, quote, would enhance rather than alter what it means to be human. He also clearly states his view that the internet enhances our lives and allows the communication of ideas in a manner that would never have been possible previously. We agree here. I wonder, though, if a strict boundary between enhancing and altering can be drawn. Our human experience today differs radically from that of our Paleolithic and Neolithic ancestors, in terms of how much of the world we are able to see, what information is available to us, the patterns in which we lead our lives, and most especially, the lengths of those lives. Many of our distant ancestors would probably consider us magicians or demigods, rather than the humans with whom they were familiar. If we are able to create giant structures on Earth and in space, this would surely broaden our range of possible experiences, as well as the resources of the universe that are accessible to us. A multiplanetary species, with the possibility of easy and fast travel among places of habitation, would be fundamentally different from today's humanity in terms of possible lifestyles and protections from extinction, even while retaining some of the same biological and intellectual characteristics. As for the internet, there are already studies suggesting that the abundance of information available online is altering the structure of many humans' thinking and interactions with that information as well as with one another. Is this any less human, or just human with a different flavor? If it is just human with a different flavor, might not the other transhumanist technologies criticized by Rocking Mr. E also be characterized this way? Rocking Mr. E does not even see any significant issues with virtual reality and mind uploading, aside from asking the legitimate question of whether a copy of a person's mind is still that person. This is a question which has been considerably explored and debated in transhumanist circles, and there is some disagreement as to the answer. My own position, expressed in my essay Transhumanism and Mind Uploading Are Not the Same, is that a copy would indeed not be the same as the individual, but a process of gradual replacement of biological neurons with artificial neurons might preserve a person's I-ness, as long as certain rather challenging prerequisites could be met. Rocking Mr. E's skepticism in this area is understandable, but it does not constitute an argument against transhumanism at all, since transhumanism does not require advocacy of mind uploading generally, or of any particular approach to mind uploading. Moreover, Rocking Mr. E does not see virtual copies of minds as posing a moral problem. In his view, this is because, quote, a program is not an organic life. We can agree that there is no moral problem posed by non-destructively creating virtual copies of biological minds. Still, in light of all of the technologies that Rocking Mr. E does not consider to be highly concerning, why in the world does he characterize transhumanism so harshly, after spending the first 40% of his video essentially clarifying that he does not take issue with the actualization of many of the common goals of transhumanists? Perhaps it is because he misunderstands what transhumanism is all about. For the technologies that Rocking Mr. E finds more alarming, he appears to think that they would allow a, quote, level of social engineering that totalitarians could only dream of during the 20th century. No transhumanist I know of would advocate such centrally planned social engineering. Rocking Mr. E aims his critique at technologies that have, quote, the potential to create human life, such as gene therapy, which can, in Rocking Mr. E's words, dictate the characteristics of life to such an extent that those making the decisions have complete control over how this forms. This argument appears to presuppose a form of genetic determinism and a denial of human free will, even though Rocking Mr. E would affirm his view that free will exists. Suppose it were possible to make a person 5 centimeters taller through genetic engineering. Does that have any bearing over how that person will actually choose to lead his life? Perhaps he could become a better basketball player than otherwise, but it is just as possible that basketball would not interest him at all, and he would rather be a taller-than-average chemist, accountant, or painter. This choice would still be up to him, and not the doctors who altered his genome, or the parents who paid for the alteration. Alteration of any genes that might influence the brain would have even less of a predetermined or even determinable impact. If parents who are influenced by the faulty view of genetic determinism try everything in their power to alter their child's genome in order to create a super genius, in their view, who is to say that this child would necessarily act out the parent's ideal? A true super genius with a will of his own is probably the most autonomous possible human. He or she would develop a set of tastes, talents, and aspirations that nobody could anticipate or manage, and would run circles around any design to control or limit his or her life. What genetic engineering could achieve, though, is to remove the obstacles to an individual's self-determination by eliminating genetic suboptimalities, diseases, weaknesses of organs, and inhibitions to clear, self-directed brain function. This is no qualitatively different from helping a child develop intellectually by taking the child out of a violent slum and putting him or her into a peaceful, nurturing, and prosperous setting. Rocking Mr. E fears that gene therapy would allow, quote, ideologues to suppress certain human characteristics. While this cannot be ruled out, any such development would be a political problem, not a technological one, and could be addressed only through reforms protecting individual freedom, not through abolition of any techniques of genetic engineering. The vicious eugenics movement of the early 20th century, to which Rocking Mr. E wrongly compares transhumanism, attempted to suppress the characteristics of whole populations of humans using very primitive technologies by today's standards. The solution to such misguided ideological movements is to maximize the scope for individual liberty, so as to allow the characteristics that individuals consider good or neutral to be preserved, and for individual wishes to be protected by law, despite what some eugenicists somewhere might think. Transhumanism is about giving each person the power to control his or her own destiny, including his or her genotype. Transhumanism is certainly not about ceding that control to others. Even a child who was genetically engineered prior to birth would, with sufficient technological advances, be able to choose to alter his or her genotype upon becoming an adult. Just as parental upbringing can influence a child but does not determine a person's entire future, so can genetic engineering decisions by parents be routed around, overcome, ignored, or utilized by the child in a far different way from the parent's original intentions. Furthermore, because parents differ considerably in their views of what the best traits would be, engineering at the wishes of parents would in no way diminish the diversity of human characteristics, and would, on the contrary, enhance such diversity by introducing new mixes of traits in addition to those already extant. This is why it is unfounded to fear, as Rocking Mr. E does, that a transhumanist society which embraces genetic engineering would turn into the society of the 1997 film Gattaca, where the non-engineered humans were excluded from non-menial work. Just as today, there is no one hierarchy of genotypes and phenotypes, neither would there be such a hierarchy in a society where genetic engineering is practiced. An even greater diversity of people would mean that an even greater diversity of opportunities would be open to all. Indeed, even Gattaca could be seen as a refutation of Rocking Mr. E's feared scenario that genetic modification would render unmodified humans unable to compete. The protagonist in Gattaca was able to overcome the prejudices of his society through willpower and ingenuity, which would remain open to all. While the society of Gattaca relied on coercion to restrict unmodified individuals from competing, a libertarian transhumanist society would have no such restrictions and would allow individuals to rise on the basis of merit alone rather than on the basis of genetics. Rocking Mr. E further expresses concern that the unintended consequences of genetic manipulation would result in viruses that could reproduce out of control and, quote, infect humans who were not the intended targets of genetic engineering. This is not a philosophical argument against transhumanism. If such a possibility even exists, and I do not know that it does, as I'm not a biologist, it could be mitigated or eliminated through careful controls in the laboratories and clinics where genetic engineering is performed. Certainly, the existence of such a possibility would not justify banning genetic manipulation, since a ban does not mean that the practice being banned goes away. Under a ban, genetic engineering would continue on the black market, where there would be far fewer safeguards in place against unintended negative consequences. It is much safer for technological innovation to proceed in the open, under a legal system that respects liberty and progress while ensuring that the rights of all are protected. Certainly, it would be justified for the legal system to protect the rights of people who do not wish to undergo certain medical treatments, such as being forced into those treatments, or having the side effects of those treatments when they are performed on others affect their own biology. People who do not wish to venture into that should be protected from those outcomes. But libertarian transhumanists could certainly agree with that point of view and would hold it consistently with regard to any technology that could conceivably impose negative external effects on non-consenting parties. Rocking Mr. E thinks that, quote, it is essential that the creation and destruction of life be protected by a code of morality that respects and recognizes natural law. Natural law being values derived from nature. He describes one tier of this natural system as comprised of relationships of trade, quote, where all individuals have unalienable rights derived from natural action, but free of coercion and the initiation of force, voluntarily associating with one another for mutual gain. He then says that, quote, only this sort of philosophy can truly prevent nihilists from justifying their evil intentions to play God and destroy or alienate any individual that doesn't adhere to a rigid set of socially engineered parameters. The latter statement is a severe misrepresentation of the aims of transhumanists, who do not support centrally planned social engineering and who are certainly not nihilists. Indeed, transhumanist technological progress is the very outcome of voluntary individual association that is free from coercion and the initiation of force. I wonder whether the so-called fierce defense envisioned by Rocking Mr. E would involve the initiation of force against innovators who attempt to improve the human genome in order to cure certain diseases, enhance human faculties, and lengthen the human lifespan. It is not clear whether Rocking Mr. E advocates such coercion, but if he does, then his opposition to the emergence of these technologies would be inimical to his own stated libertarian philosophy. In other words, his conclusions are completely incompatible with his premises. Toward the end of his video, Rocking Mr. E uses the example of three-person in vitro fertilization, IVF, as an illustration, quote, of how far down the road of transhumanism we are. What, dare I ask, is wrong with three-person IVF? Rocking Mr. E believes that it is a contributor to, quote, gradually destroying the natural definition of parenting. Yet parenting is a set of actions to raise a child, not a method of originating that child. If Rocking Mr. E has any problems with children who are brought into this world using three-person IVF, then what about children who are adopted and raised by parents who had no part in their conception? Is that not even more removed from parents who contributed at least some of their genetic material? Furthermore, IVF has been available in some form since the birth of Louise Brown in 1978, 35 years ago. Since then, approximately 5 million people have been created using IVF. Are they any less human than the rest of us? Have we as a species lost some fraction of our humanity as a result? Surely not. And if similar consequences to what has already happened are what Rocking Mr. E fears, then I submit that there is no basis for fear at all. New techniques for creating life and enhancing human potential may not be in line with what Rocking Mr. E considers natural, but perhaps his view equates the unnatural to the unfamiliar to Rocking Mr. E. But he does not have to personally embrace any method of genetic engineering or medically assisted creation of life. He is free to abstain from such techniques himself. What he ought to do, though, as a self-professed libertarian and individualist, is to allow the rest of us, as individuals, the same prerogative to choose to use or abstain from using these technologies as they become available. The shape that the resulting future takes, as long as it is based on these freedom-respecting principles, is not for Rocking Mr. E to decide or limit. Thank you very much.